Rain poured steadily, soaking the fresh mound of dirt as Ethan stood motionless, staring at the small coffin being lowered into the earth. The weight of the moment pressed down on his chest, suffocating him. He could hear the muffled cries of family and friends around him, but they felt distant, like echoes from another world. His son, his 5-year-old Liam, was gone. Forever. The priest's voice droned on, offering words of comfort that felt hollow. No words could fill the void inside him. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, trying to ground himself in the present, but his mind kept drifting. His eyes scanned the gathering of mourners, their faces a blur of sorrow and pity. But one face was missing. Jessica wasn't there. He had known she wouldn't come, but a part of him had hoped that no matter how much she had pulled away, how much she had changed, she would still care enough to say goodbye to their son. But she was thousands of miles away, basking in the Hawaiian sun with another man, while he stood here, burying the child they had once created together. Whispers floated through the air, barely concealed behind lowered voices and sympathetic glances. She didn't even show up. Can you believe it? His own mother. I heard she's with some guy in Hawaii. Imagine that. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. What was there to say? The truth was out, and it was just as ugly as the pain tearing him apart inside. He could feel the pity in their eyes, the judgment in their hushed tones. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. He looked down to see his sister, Claire, her eyes red and puffy. "Ethan," she whispered, "you should say something." What was there to say? That Liam had been the best part of him, that his laughter had once filled their home, and now the silence was unbearable, that he would never get to tuck him in again, never hear him call him Daddy in his small, sweet voice. Words failed him. The priest cleared his throat expectantly. Everyone was waiting. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped forward, forcing himself to speak past the lump in his throat. "Liam." His voice broke. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather himself. "Liam was my everything. He was kind, full of life. He never let anything bring him down. Even when he was sick, even when he was tired, he always smiled. His breath hitched. "I don't know how to do this without him." Silence stretched. A sob escaped someone in the crowd. Ethan stepped back, unable to say more. As the first handful of dirt was thrown onto the coffin, final and absolute, something inside him shattered. Jessica had moved on. But how could he? The morning after the funeral, Ethan found himself sitting in his dimly lit living room, still in his funeral clothes. The weight of Liam's loss felt unbearable, but it wasn't just grief that gnawed at him. It was the slow, creeping realization that Jessica, his wife, wasn't just absent from their son's funeral. She was somewhere far away, living a life without him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Mark, his best friend. Ethan hesitated for a moment before opening it. Mark had always been there, but today, his message hit differently. "Man, I'm sorry for everything you're going through. I hate to tell you this, but I saw Jessica at the airport yesterday. She was with some guy in Hawaii." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His breath caught, his chest tightening as if he couldn't draw air. He stared at the message, blinking rapidly as his mind struggled to process it. Hawaii? She was on vacation with another man while he was burying their son. Ethan's hands trembled as he held his phone, staring at the screen. The images of Jessica laughing, holding hands with someone else, flashed through his mind, each one more painful than the last. The world seemed to blur around him, and he felt the ground shift beneath him. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a punch to the very core of everything he had known. The memories started to flood in, unbidden. The way their marriage had begun to fracture when Liam was diagnosed. The hospital visits, the sleepless nights, the unspoken distance that had grown between them. Jessica had become a ghost in their home, barely speaking, barely touching him. She seemed to be retreating further into herself, leaving him to deal with the weight of their son's illness alone. And then there was the affair. Ethan had always suspected something, but the moments of doubt were easily dismissed. Until now. How long had she been seeing this man? Was it while Liam was still alive? The thought of her betraying him, both emotionally and physically, felt like a slap in the face. Rage boiled inside him. How could she do this? How could she be so callous, so selfish? Ethan's fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His son was dead, and she was off living her life, untouched by the pain that had consumed him. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was fury. Raw, unbridled fury. Ethan wandered aimlessly through the house, his footsteps heavy, as if the very air around him was weighed down by the loss. The silence was deafening. No laughter, no footsteps running through the hallways, no tiny voice calling out for help or for playtime. He couldn't escape it. The silence that had taken over every inch of their home, replacing the joy that once filled it. As he passed by Liam's bedroom, the door cracked open just enough for him to see the small, untouched toys scattered across the floor. He hadn't been able to bring himself to clean up yet. Everything felt too raw, too painful. His eyes fell on the small toy box, its lid slightly ajar, and he moved toward it, almost instinctively. Inside, hidden beneath a pile of stuffed animals and action figures, was an envelope. The paper was creased, the edges slightly torn, as if it had been handled repeatedly. His name, Daddy, was written in Liam's childish scrawl on the front. Ethan's heart clenched in his chest. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, and inside, he found a small letter written in crayon. Dear Daddy, I love you. Don't be sad. I will always be with you. Please smile when you think of me, so I can smile too. I want you and Mommy to be happy again. Maybe you can laugh and play like we used to. I'll be with you always, in your heart, forever and ever. I love you, Daddy. The simple words were like a dagger to his heart. Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes as he read the letter over and over again, each time feeling the weight of it more deeply. Liam had been so small, so innocent, yet so wise in his childlike way. He had understood, in his brief time on this earth, that his parents needed to find happiness, that even in the midst of their pain, they had to move forward somehow. The anger that had consumed Ethan for the past few days started to wane, replaced by a deep ache. Liam had wanted them to be happy. He hadn't wanted his parents to fall apart. Ethan's grief intensified, the hollow ache inside him growing with every line of the letter. But at the same time, something else stirred within him, a sense of purpose, a need to honor his son's wishes. He had to find a way to live, to keep going. For Liam, he would not let this grief consume him entirely. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, holding the letter to his chest. He promised Liam, silently, that he would try to find a way to smile again, to move forward. He couldn't let the darkness take over, not for his son, not now. Ethan's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stood in front of the upscale resort, the golden sands of Hawaii stretching out before him. He had made the long journey, fueled by anger, hurt, and a desperate need for answers. His mind raced with images of Jessica and Daniel, her new lover, laughing and holding hands. He had to see it with his own eyes, had to confront her. The thought of her, so callously moving on while he stood in the shadow of their son's grave, ate away at him. As he stepped through the resort's grand entrance, the air was thick with the scent of salt water and tropical flowers, a stark contrast to the coldness he felt inside. Ethan's eyes scanned the area, searching for her, for them. And then he saw her. Jessica. She was sitting on a lounge chair by the pool, wearing a bright, carefree smile, her hair flowing in the gentle breeze. And beside her, laughing at something she said, was Daniel. Ethan's stomach twisted in knots as he watched them. Jessica, looking so carefree, so at ease, while his world had shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, her laugh bright and light, as if nothing had changed, as if their son had never existed. Without thinking, Ethan walked toward them, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't care about the serene beauty of the place or the people around him. All that mattered was the woman who had shattered his heart, the woman who had abandoned their son in his final days. As he approached, Jessica noticed him. The smile on her face faltered for a split second, before she quickly regained her composure. Daniel looked up, recognizing Ethan immediately, but it was Jessica who spoke first. "Ethan." Her voice was cool, emotionless, as if she were speaking to a stranger. "Is this how you grieve, Jessica?" Ethan's voice was low, his words laced with disgust. "While I bury our son, you're here, on vacation, with him." He gestured toward Daniel, who was now standing awkwardly, sensing the tension in the air. Jessica's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained detached, almost defensive. "Don't do this here, Ethan. Not now," she said, her tone cold, distant. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the anger rising up like a storm. "Not now? Not now. While I'm forced to live in this nightmare, you're out here living." His voice cracked, raw with the weight of his emotions. Before he could stop himself, he lunged toward Daniel, shoving him roughly. Daniel staggered back, caught off guard, his eyes wide in shock. "How could you do this to me? To our son?" Ethan shouted, his voice breaking. Jessica stood up, her face a mask of coldness, as if his pain meant nothing. "You have no right to tell me how to live my life, Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of any real feeling. "I did what I had to do." "Did you?" Ethan retorted bitterly. "You didn't even have the decency to be here for our son's funeral. How dare you say that?" Daniel, now on his feet, tried to step between them, his hand raised as if to calm Ethan down. "Ethan, man, you don't have to do this." But Ethan was beyond reason. His vision blurred with rage, and he pushed Daniel once more, this time harder, sending him stumbling backwards. Ethan turned toward Jessica. "You don't deserve him," he spat, pointing toward Daniel. "And you don't deserve me. You never did." For a long moment, there was silence. Jessica's face softened for a second, but it wasn't regret that flashed in her eyes. It was simply the resignation of a woman who had moved on, who had decided that the past was behind her. "You're right," she said softly. "I've moved on. I have to." Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, the fury in him slowly fading into an unbearable emptiness. His mind struggled to grasp what had just happened. He had come here, looking for closure, for justice, but all he found was a cold truth he wasn't ready to face. In that moment, as he stood alone in the bright Hawaiian sun, it hit him. He was truly alone. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers rubbing the fabric of the quilt that had once been a symbol of warmth and togetherness. Now, it only reminded him of the distance between him and Jessica. He closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back. Memories of a time when things had been different, when their love had felt unbreakable. The day Liam was diagnosed with leukemia was a turning point, a moment when everything began to change. Ethan could still remember the sterile smell of the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the weight of the doctor's words. "I'm afraid it's leukemia," the doctor had said. Ethan had felt the blood drain from his face, the world tilting sideways as he heard those words. He had looked over at Jessica, expecting to see a look of disbelief, of pain, something to mirror his own agony. But instead, Jessica had been still, her face almost blank. The tears had come later, when they were alone in the car, when Ethan had broken down, unable to hold it in any longer. But even in those moments, something between them had changed. Jessica had become more distant, emotionally unreachable. She tried to mask it with smiles and forced optimism, but Ethan could feel her slipping away, retreating into herself. Their conversations became shallow, their touches mechanical. The intimacy that had once defined their relationship was now a distant memory. Ethan did everything he could to be there for Liam, taking him to doctor's appointments, staying up late during the nights when fever would break out, holding him through his pain. But Jessica seemed to pull further away with every passing day. There was no warmth in her eyes anymore, no softness in her voice. She had become cold, almost detached, and Ethan had started to feel it, the gap growing between them. He couldn't pinpoint when it had started, but there had been signs, small things at first. The late nights at work, the empty conversations, the growing silence between them. He had assumed she was just overwhelmed, as he was, by the weight of their son's illness. But as time went on, he began to notice other signs. The way Jessica would glance at her phone in secret, the way she would brush off his touch, the way she seemed to disappear into herself more and more each day. One day, Ethan had come home early from the hospital to find Jessica standing by the window, looking out at the sunset. Her phone was resting on the table, face down, but something about the way she had reacted when he walked in told him everything he needed to know. He asked her once, casually, "Who's been texting you?" She had frozen, her expression quickly shifting into something unreadable. "Just work," she said, her voice too smooth, too rehearsed. But Ethan knew. He could feel it in his gut. The affair had begun then, in those quiet moments when she had grown increasingly distant, in the space between her words and actions. He had never asked her directly, never confronted her with his suspicions. He wasn't ready to face the truth. But deep down, he knew it. As Liam's condition worsened, Ethan had been consumed by the need to care for him, and for the first time in their marriage, he felt completely alone. The numbness that had taken over Ethan's life after Liam's death was quickly replaced by something darker. It started with the quiet evenings, the hours spent staring at the walls, the weight of grief pressing down on him. And then came the alcohol. At first, it was just a drink to help him sleep, a way to silence the constant ache in his chest. But soon, one drink turned into two, and then three. The emptiness inside him began to feel even more unbearable when sober. So he drank to forget, to escape, even if just for a little while. He stopped going to work, stopped meeting friends, stopped leaving the house. The once lively home was now a prison, every corner filled with memories that were too painful to bear. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes unkempt, his skin pale. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered anymore. Mark, his best friend since childhood, had tried to reach out, tried to help him through the darkest days. He'd come over knocking on the door, pleading for Ethan to let him in. "Come on, man, you can't keep doing this. You've got to face this, face the pain," Mark would say, trying to pull Ethan out of his spiraling descent. But Ethan didn't want help. He didn't want anyone's sympathy or advice. He just wanted the pain to stop. He could feel the bitterness in his veins, the rage building with every drink he poured. And so, he shut himself off from everyone, preferring the isolation that alcohol brought. The nights blurred together, an endless cycle of emptiness and regret. Ethan began to forget the faces of his family, the voices of his friends. The one thing that remained constant was the bottle in his hand. And then one day, Mark stopped coming. The weight of his isolation finally caught up with him. Something inside him told him it was time to finally face what he had been running from. He had never visited Liam's grave, not once since the funeral. It felt too final, too permanent. But that morning, with the ache of grief heavier than ever, Ethan knew he had to go. The graveyard was quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Ethan's heart pounded as he made his way toward the small headstone, the name Liam engraved so neatly, so coldly. The grief hit him in waves, crashing against him with such force that his legs gave out beneath him. He fell to his knees, the tears that had been trapped inside him finally breaking free. He didn't know how long he stayed there, his body shaking with sobs, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The pain of losing his son, the anger at Jessica, the overwhelming emptiness that had swallowed him whole. It all poured out in that moment. Liam was gone, and Ethan was left with nothing but a broken heart and a grave that would never be enough. He felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, crumbling beneath the weight of his grief. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel everything, to truly feel the depth of his loss. When he finally stood up, his legs unsteady, his face streaked with tears, he knew that the path ahead would be long and difficult. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to start facing the truth. Ethan sat in the dim light of his living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the stillness. His phone buzzed, a simple notification that cut through the silence. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the subject line, proof of Jessica's affair. He opened the email, his hands trembling slightly as he clicked through the message. It was a series of screenshots, messages, pictures, and even receipts that traced Jessica's affair with Daniel back to months before Liam's death. The timestamp on the first message was just weeks after Liam's diagnosis. The texts were filled with flirtations, plans to meet, and promises of secrecy. Ethan's stomach twisted as he read through the exchanges. The words were cold, calculated, nothing like the love and trust he had believed existed between him and Jessica. "I can't wait to see you again. It's been too long. I miss you," one message read. Another said, "Let's keep this between us. I don't want anyone to know yet, especially not Ethan." Ethan could feel his blood boil, his chest tightening with a mix of betrayal and fury. He had suspected it, of course. Those moments of doubt had never quite left him. But seeing the evidence, seeing the proof of how long it had been going on, shattered any lingering doubts. Jessica had not only abandoned him during their son's illness, but she had also been living a double life. His vision blurred with anger as the weight of the betrayal hit him full force. She had kept this from him, kept him in the dark while they both fought for their son's life. It was unbearable. The email was a slap in the face, but it also gave him something else: purpose. He wasn't just grieving anymore. He was angry, and he was determined to make Jessica pay for what she had done. She would never get away with this, not while Liam was gone. The courtroom felt like a cold, suffocating place as Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him, and his eyes fixed on Jessica. She was on the opposite side, sitting with her attorney, her posture rigid and composed, a mask of indifference on her face. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with paperwork, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. But now, as the trial began, the weight of it all felt heavier than ever. Ethan had filed the lawsuit for emotional distress, fraud, and the irreparable harm caused by Jessica's affair and betrayal. The evidence, pictures, text messages, and testimony from Mark, who had witnessed the changes in Jessica, was damning. The truth had come to light. Jessica had been seeing Daniel for months, hiding the affair from Ethan while their son fought for his life. Ethan's lawyer argued that Jessica had violated the trust in their marriage and had caused Ethan unimaginable emotional pain. But what hurt the most was the fraud. How she had hidden assets, moved money behind his back, and lied about her finances during a time when they should have been a united front. Jessica, however, remained stone-faced. Throughout the trial, she gave nothing away. There were no tears, no apologies, just a cold, calculated defense. She claimed that she had been unhappy in their marriage, that Ethan's grief had pushed her away, and that she had found solace in Daniel. As the courtroom listened to her testimony, Ethan felt the bile rise in his throat. Her words were empty, hollow. She wasn't sorry for the pain she had caused him. She wasn't sorry for any of it. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan took the stand. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. He spoke not just about the betrayal, but about the emotional devastation he had faced after Liam's death. The overwhelming loneliness, the isolation, the despair. He described how Jessica's absence during their son's final days had broken him in ways he couldn't express. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of guilt in Jessica's eyes, but it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. After days of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Ethan won. The court awarded him full financial control, including the family home, savings, and investments. Jessica and Daniel were left with nothing. The assets that had once been shared between them were now solely Ethan's. He had secured his future, but it came at a great cost. His marriage was over, and the relationship with his son would never be repaired. Jessica's face twisted with disbelief as the judge pronounced the ruling. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. She stood up abruptly, as if eager to leave, but Ethan didn't care. He had won, but in the hollow victory, there was no satisfaction. The damage had been done, and the weight of it would linger long after the final gavel fell. Ethan sat in the sterile hospital office, his heart pounding as he tried to focus on the words the doctor was saying. He had come to this appointment with a simple question. Why? Why had Liam's condition deteriorated so quickly in his final days? He had assumed it was just the cruel progression of the disease, but as the doctor hesitated, his intuition told him something was wrong. "Mr. Hawthorne," the doctor began, shifting in his seat, his voice cautious. "I want to be transparent with you, but what I'm about to tell you is not easy to hear." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could feel his palms sweat, his stomach churning. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor looked away for a moment, collecting his thoughts. Jessica refused the final treatment, the one that could have prolonged Liam's life by several more months, perhaps even a year. Ethan's mind went blank. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of what he had just heard. Jessica, his wife, the mother of their child, had refused treatment that could have given Liam more time. He stared at the doctor, the words failing to register. Why would she do that? Why would she not want to try everything to save him? The doctor's expression was sympathetic, but firm. She said it was too invasive, too painful for Liam to endure in his weakened state. But we believed it was worth the risk. She disagreed. Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift, his heart crashing in his chest. Jessica had made that decision. She had chosen to let their son die sooner. The truth shattered everything he had known. His son could have lived longer. And it was Jessica's refusal that had robbed him of that precious time. The world around Ethan seemed to tilt as the weight of the revelation sank in. The anger and disbelief surged within him, but nothing could fill the emptiness that spread like a dark cloud over his soul. Ethan's mind became consumed by a singular thought: revenge. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, nor was it about the courtroom victory. It was about the unbearable truth he had learned. Jessica's betrayal had cost him precious moments with Liam. Those final months, those final days with his son could have been different. Liam could have had a fighting chance, but Jessica had chosen to let him go. He found himself spending hours at his computer, scrolling through Jessica's social media accounts. At first, it had been a fleeting curiosity, a desire to understand her life without him. But soon, it turned into an obsession. He watched her post photos of herself on trips, laughing with Daniel, living a life that seemed untouched by the pain she had caused. Every picture, every status update felt like a slap to the face. She was living, thriving, while he was still drowning in the aftermath of their shattered life. It was as if she had never loved him, never cared. The happiness she displayed on social media was a lie, a facade. And Ethan became fixated on exposing that lie. His days blurred together, consumed by the need to dig deeper into her life. He found herself obsessively tracking her online activity, reading old messages, analyzing every post for clues about her relationship with Daniel, about her deceitful actions. He would often sit at his desk, staring at his phone for hours, waiting for a new update, a new hint that could unravel everything she had worked so hard to bury. At night, the obsession grew darker. He would replay the scenes in his mind, Jessica laughing with Daniel, her indifference during Liam's final days, the coldness that had overtaken their relationship. The images twisted in his head, turning into a toxic swirl of anger and vengeance. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. His work became irrelevant, his friendships strained. He would lie awake, obsessing over ways to hurt her, to make her feel the same pain he had endured. His thoughts spiraled, each passing day more desperate than the last. Ethan could no longer distinguish between right and wrong, truth and lies. The line between justice and revenge had blurred, and all that was left was the burning need to destroy the woman who had taken everything from him. He wasn't just consumed by the desire for revenge anymore. He had become a shadow of himself, lost in a dangerous obsession. It was as though the pain had molded him into something unrecognizable, something driven entirely by bitterness and anger. And it scared him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The news hit Ethan like a freight train. It was a simple message, a text sent without warning. "I'm pregnant, Ethan. It's Daniel's." His hand shook as he stared at the screen, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been expecting this moment for a while, but he wasn't prepared for how it would feel. His chest tightened, suffocating under the weight of the words. She was having a child with him, the man who had replaced Ethan in their marriage, the man who had been there while he had been fighting for their son's life. The betrayal felt so raw, so deep, that it was hard to breathe. The world around him felt like it was collapsing. For weeks, he had held on to the faint hope that there was a chance to fix things, to rebuild the family that had once meant everything to him. But now, with the news of her pregnancy, that hope was extinguished. There was no going back. Anger burned within him, a rage that was all-consuming. He couldn't contain it. He needed to confront her, to see it for himself, to understand how she could move on so easily after everything they had been through, after everything she had done to him. Without thinking, Ethan drove to Jessica's house. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The closer he got, the more his anger built, until it reached a fever pitch. When he arrived, he didn't knock. He didn't wait for permission. He stormed through the door, slamming it open, his eyes scanning the house for her. Jessica was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her expression unreadable. "You're pregnant?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "With his child? After everything?" Jessica didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She sat there, cold and unmoving, as if his presence didn't matter to her at all. "Ethan," she said, her voice flat. "I don't have to explain myself to you." His hands trembled with fury, his fists clenching and unclenching, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to destroy everything in his path. But instead, he stood there, staring at the woman who had once been his wife, who had once promised to love him and honor their family. "You really don't care, do you?" he asked, his voice cracking, though he was trying so hard to control it. Jessica didn't respond. Her eyes were vacant, distant. There was nothing left of the woman he had once known. No warmth, no remorse, no love. For a long moment, they just stood there, locked in a silence that spoke volumes. And in that silence, Ethan realized something that broke him even more than the betrayal itself. Jessica was already gone, and there was no part of her left for him to save. His hands dropped to his sides. The anger that had driven him here slowly began to drain from him, replaced by an emptiness he couldn't escape. "Goodbye, Jessica," he whispered, his voice hollow. Then he turned and left, knowing that nothing would ever bring him peace again. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence pressing in on Ethan like a heavy weight. He had lost everything: his son, his marriage, and his own peace of mind. The darkness of revenge had consumed him for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to feel anything else. His thoughts were still consumed by the need to make Jessica pay, to hurt her the way she had hurt him. But something inside him was shifting. As he rummaged through old boxes in the attic, searching for something, anything to distract him, he found it. An old voice recorder, worn from use, but still intact. It was something Liam had used for fun, recording his little thoughts or singing silly songs when he was younger. The memories of Liam flooded back instantly, the way his son's laughter had filled the house, the way his innocent voice had brought light into their home. Ethan pressed play, the familiar click of the recorder breaking the silence. "Hi, Daddy. I love you, and I hope you feel better today. Don't be sad, okay? I want you to smile." The sound of Liam's voice was so clear, so pure, that it felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan's heart ached as the tears welled in his eyes. His son, the little boy who had loved him without question, had wanted him to be happy. In that moment, something inside Ethan shifted. The rage that had been consuming him suddenly felt pointless. Liam wouldn't have wanted this. The need for revenge, the bitterness that had taken root in his soul, began to fade. Liam's innocent, loving words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in months, Ethan realized that holding on to anger would never bring him peace. It wouldn't bring Liam back. He could choose to keep drowning in his grief, or he could begin to heal. He chose healing. With a deep breath, he turned off the recorder, feeling a flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in so long. Ethan knew it was time to leave. The house, the city, the memories. It all felt like it was suffocating him. Every corner of their home whispered reminders of the life he had lost, the son he could never get back, the woman who had betrayed him. He had to start over, somewhere new, somewhere he could breathe again. So, he packed his things and left the house, leaving behind the life that had once been his. He moved to a small town a few hours away, far from the ghosts that haunted his every step. The change was daunting, but it felt necessary. He needed a fresh start, and he had heard about a job working with sick children at a local hospital, a position that felt like it might give him purpose again. At first, it was hard. The children he worked with were facing the same kind of pain and loss he had felt, and it brought back memories he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But the more time he spent with them, the more he found a new sense of meaning in his life. He wasn't just existing anymore, he was making a difference. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt that spark of hope again. One day, while he was volunteering in the hospital's playroom, he met Sarah, a woman with a kind smile and an undeniable warmth about her. She was a nurse, and she had a way of talking to the children, making them laugh, making them forget their pain, even for just a little while. She was different from everyone he had known before. She was compassionate, understanding, and patient, qualities Ethan had thought he would never find again. Over time, they became friends. Ethan found himself drawn to her gentle nature, her ability to listen without judgment, and the way she made him feel like he wasn't broken. There were moments when Ethan wondered if he could ever love again, if he could ever trust anyone enough to let them in. But with Sarah, it felt different. She didn't push him. She didn't ask for more than he could give. She simply was, a steady presence in his life, one that helped him heal without rushing him. As the days went on, Ethan realized something he hadn't expected: helping others, seeing the joy he could bring to these children, seeing the way Sarah brought light into the lives of those around her, was slowly mending the broken parts of him. He was beginning to find peace, piece by piece. He wasn't whole yet. He probably never would be. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan could see the possibility of a future, one filled with hope, healing, and maybe, just maybe, love again. Years had passed since Ethan had left everything behind, and though the ache of losing Liam would never fully disappear, time had softened it. He had found peace in places he hadn't expected, in the faces of the children he helped, in the quiet moments with Sarah, in the way life continued to unfold, even after loss. He had built a life, a new one, but there was one thing left unsettled, a part of him that still needed closure. On a cool autumn afternoon, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of a small cemetery. The wind whispered through the trees, and the leaves crunched beneath his feet as he walked slowly toward the grave he had visited so many times before. He stood there for a long while, his hand resting gently on the cold stone marker that bore Liam's name. The weight of his son's absence pressed against his chest, but it no longer felt suffocating. "I hope you know, buddy, I've tried," he whispered to the grave, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to be better, to move on, to honor you in the best way I can." He stood there, just talking to Liam, as if the boy could still hear him. It was his way of finally saying everything he hadn't been able to say in those agonizing months before Liam's death. The pain of those moments had faded, but the love for his son, the grief for the boy who had left too soon, would always remain. Just as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Ethan pulled it out, expecting another mundane message, but instead, his eyes widened as he saw the sender's name. Jessica. He opened the email, and his fingers trembled slightly as he read the words. "Ethan, I can't keep running from this. I've thought about everything, about the way I hurt you, about the things I did and the choices I made. I regret every moment of it. You deserved more than what I gave you. Liam deserved more than what I gave him. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day you'll find peace. You were a good father, and I'm sorry I failed you both. I will always regret it, Jessica." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment, the words sinking into his chest. There it was, the apology he had longed for. But as he read it, he felt no anger, no need for revenge, only a quiet acceptance. It wasn't the apology that mattered anymore. It was the fact that he had finally come to terms with everything. He had moved on. With a soft sigh, Ethan closed his eyes and smiled. Not with joy, but with a deep, understanding sadness. It was done. The hurt was behind him. Liam's memory would always be a part of him, but he no longer carried the weight of the past on his shoulders. He had finally found peace. And for the first time in years, Ethan walked away from the grave, with his heart just a little bit lighter.